Back in 2001, the Department of Education issued a framework policy document. It was called White Paper 6, Special Needs Education, Building an Inclusive Education and Training System to be implemented in schools across the country. Now, this coincided with an ever-evolving commitment to de-racialize the population and promote social cohesion at large. Amid the global protest over the discriminatory treatment of people of color within societal institutions and structures, cries have surfaced around the country. And once again, there are calls to address this issue of racism and discrimination at various Model C and private schools. Our CEO of Aarya Legal, Maushami Chetty, joins us on the line to chat further about ways in which we can better navigate unconscious bias and conversations about race, gender, sex, discrimination and privilege in the classroom. Maushami, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us here on Weekend Dawn. I just want to know what the role of race in relation to inclusive education is and how far have we come in South Africa?
Good morning, Liesl. Thanks so much for having me. Well, race is something that is encoded into South Africa's DNA in a sense. And I think we've done very little to deal with it. And what we're hearing from students through many of the manifestos that have been released online, as well as I'm sure you've seen the Instagram account, You Silence, We Amplify, is that race continues to be an ongoing problem in South African schools. I was, in fact, the first person of color integrated into my primary school in 1992, and it's quite heartbreaking to see that 28 years later, the stories and the experiences of students are very much the same. But I'm not here today to talk about the experiences of the students and to sort of delve into that. I think we've done a lot of that in the media in the last week or two. But to really talk about what can we do to change that experience in the classroom.
And then, Mosh, looking at the psychosocial effects of institutional racism at large and some of the barriers of challenging those stereotypes, I mean, what has surfaced to date?
So what we're seeing a lot of is what you could consider blatant racism. So students in power and in student leadership, as well as teachers singling out children of color, making them tell racist jokes, telling racist jokes, using the K word, using the N word. But what we're also seeing a lot of is what we call micro-expressions and micro-affirmations and microaggressions. So people calling children by the wrong name for years on end, mixing up the names of children of color. And all of these things in terms of the research have an adverse effect on children's ability to perform in the classroom. And so what we've done is we've created a teacher training program in order to tackle unconscious bias directly and to teach teachers how to have the conversation about race in the classroom in a non-negative and non-abrasive way. So at the moment, we're not really talking about race head-on. It's like South Africa's dirty little secret, and yet it continues to manifest itself in every way in the classroom. So how do we navigate these conversations? How do we equip teachers with the ability to talk about these things directly in a way that's positive and in a way that is anti-racist?
So Maushami, I'm looking at the definitions that permeate the assumptions of authority and implicit bias. Without giving away too much of your toolkit, I mean, what are some of the avenues you explore? How long are the programs? Who is it aimed at large?
So what we do is we like to tackle unconscious bias first. And the reason is that when you talk about racism, everyone gets defensive. Because racism is, there's a bad guy out there. It's not me. I'm not racist. And so when you're trying to deal with racism head on, you get a lot of defensiveness and a lot of fragility. But unconscious bias, on the other hand, is they're learned stereotypes. They're automatic. They're unintentional. They're deeply ingrained. They're universal. We all have them. Being biased is something ingrained into humanity as a basis of the way we've evolved as a people. So, for example, thousands of years ago, we lived in small groups. We were fairly homogenous. Everyone looked alike, and we had to learn to tell a hostile group from our in-group. And this ingrained behavior in a cosmopolitan society can be quite dangerous. But when we tackle unconscious bias, what we're tackling is the fact that we all are biased, whether it's on the basis of gender, race, age, height, body shape. And so we need to tackle and bring those unconscious biases to light so that we can start making more fair decisions, because they do affect the decisions we make, particularly in the classroom.
Maushami, what is the role of policy in perhaps promoting social justice in South Africa, particularly at a time that we find ourselves in?
Well, I think not enough has been done to make it very explicit that we need to almost re-educate ourselves. So if you look at a history of 60 years of apartheid and even longer of colonialism, we start learning ingrained ways of thinking about certain people. And we've never really, and the government's never really taken a policy stance to say we need to have active re-education around that. I know that you've mentioned one of the white papers, but how that plays out in the classroom is very different. We've also never really directly tackled the fact that there's moving human pieces in this. And those human moving pieces haven't really tackled their own biases. They might be delivering a curriculum which is world-class and which deals with gender issues and which deals with racial issues, but they themselves have not dealt and done the hard work, because it is hard, lifelong work to undo your biases. And there's nothing really tackling that. So this is why we created this program about 5 years ago, and we've trialed it with a number of private schools as and when they've had the need. But schools, as you can tell, are quite reluctant to go into this. But I'm hoping that, given what's happened in the media recently and the fact that children are crying out for assistance, that we're going to have a lot more traction.
Maushami actually mentioned an important point about the school's historical relationship to black people or people of color, and perhaps how that, because it's gone or it's been overlooked over the past few years, particularly since we came into democracy in South Africa. How's that affected the current relationship that we find, particularly in the Model C and private schools?
Whether it's conscious or unconscious, we can't get away from the fact that we were only desegregated 28 years ago. I mean, I remember once sitting around a table in Los Angeles and mentioning to people that I was the first person of color in my school. And they were mind blown, because in their heads, it's something that happened in the 60s and it's in black and white. But it's actual people who are continuing to have those experiences today. So you have a traditionally white or segregated environment that hasn't really, even after 28 years, learned to make peace with the fact that you've got people from different backgrounds. And so we need to tackle this head on. I don't think 28 years later, given what's happening on social media and what children are crying for, and they're showing extremely articulate arguments. They're showing extreme leadership. Arundhati Roy once said, "There's another world, and sometimes on a quiet night I can hear her breathing." And that's how I feel about South Africa at the moment, because these children are showing exemplary leadership, and they're asking for something that's a potential South Africa that's informed, young, smart, and integrated. And we need to, as the adults, help them facilitate that.
So, Mosh, just looking at the possible solutions that obviously are on the table as we speak. You mentioned that there is a toolkit, but how do we incorporate learning more about our history, the narratives about our history that have been told, and also looking at some of those paradigm shifts that have to happen at large, and the programs that already exist that we could perhaps build on? I mean, what do you advise?
So we can never do any of this kind of, so what we've created is a workshop, as well as a teacher training toolkit, which includes a glossary of terms about race, about gender, about discrimination, which teachers, much older teachers, don't really have access to, and also class plans, exercises about how to talk about class and sort of unpack those biases in a really non-aggressive way. But we can never do any of that without having a deep understanding of where we're coming from, because our biases that we learn unconsciously, you can pick up biases as young as 3. You pick these up against the backdrop of our history. So we have to make sure that our history curriculum is correctly reflecting the realities, and our lesson plans are really correctly reflecting the realities of what's happened in South Africa. And I think that's an ongoing conversation that we need to have.
Maushami Chetty, just looking at it being Youth Month, just looking at the strides that have been taken since 1976 and where we find ourselves today. I just want to know from you, what gives you hope about South Africa? What does it mean to be a youth in South Africa in this day and age? How have you come to understand that for yourself?
I think I've probably already answered that, and that is that I'm very, very impressed with how I've seen students handle this. They've written very, very clear and articulate manifestos. And I was listening to a conversation with one of the boys from Bishop on a radio station, and he said, I think Bishop's has done a very good job, and probably too good a job, educating us to be leaders. And so I think they've shown exemplary leadership. I think we as older people need to step in, listen to them, and take the appropriate action.
Maushami Chetty, CEO of Aarya Legal, thank you very much for joining us on Weekend Dawn. Just unpacking ways in which we can better navigate unconscious bias and also have conversations about race, gender, sex discrimination and prejudice at large, as well as privilege, particularly within the classroom, based on some of the incidents that have surfaced around the country and the world over to date.